Now, it's a great pleasure to introduce our first plenary speaker, Dr. Mark Schipp. In 2012, Mark was elected to the OIE Council and in 2015 was elected Vice President of the OIE General Assembly. He's Chair of Wildlife Health Australia Management Committee and Chair of the Animal Health Committee. Together with the Chief Medical Officer, Mark chairs the Australian Strategic and Technical Advisory Group on Antimicrobial Resistance. Previously, Mark has held positions responsible for animal-derived food production inspection, market export and export certification. He served 2 terms overseas as Agricultural Councillor in Seoul, South Korea, and in Beijing, China. Mark is a veterinary graduate of Murdoch University. After graduation, he worked with the Western Australian Department of Agriculture. He is a great supporter of the AVA, an accomplished veterinarian, and someone who I consider a friend. Mark also happens to be Australia's Chief Veterinary Officer, a position he has held since 2011, and is President-elect of OIE. Please give a warm welcome to Dr. Mark Schipp.
Good morning, and thank you very much for the opportunity to speak with you. So I'll be speaking on Australian veterinarians and the global challenges, and it's quite fitting, I think, to reflect also on some of the messages that came from the Governor that we just heard. The roles that veterinarians play in our society are easily defined. They care for the health, well-being and welfare of pets and production animals, hold roles in academia and also in industry. Veterinarians have important roles to play in animal, human and community well-being. Veterinarians in rural and regional Australia ensure the safety of the food we eat and export and look to our biosecurity, helping to identify and respond to serious disease outbreaks. 2/3 of Australian households now include companion animals, and pets are seen as important family members. As we heard from the Governor, there is a significant body of evidence that pet ownership has benefits to the health and well-being of individuals and the community. As the relationship between animals and humans has evolved, so the role of veterinarians has matured from that of being a simple horse doctor servicing the conveyances of the day, to one where veterinarians are offering the same surgical and medical procedures as would be used on the other members of our families. We all have a traditional image in our heads of the role of veterinarians, the small animal practitioner in the suburbs, the valiant veterinarian in rural mixed practice. For those of us old enough, these images were informed by the media of our day, the James Herriot books and TV series. But what is the real situation in Australia? The AVA has commissioned a workforce modelling report to inform our contemporary understanding of the profession in Australia and found that we have a major oversupply of veterinarians in Australia, which their modelling shows will persist through to 2025. With supply exceeding demand by over 50%. Yet there are 2 areas of veterinary practice that are consistently in undersupply through all demand scenarios: government services and other services, where other includes areas such as aquaculture, animal welfare, avian, laboratory services, poultry, reproduction, wildlife and consultancy practice. So we have an oversupply of veterinarians in Australia, except in the field of government service. What is it that government veterinarians do? I have been a government veterinarian since I graduated from Murdoch University in 1989, initially with the West Australian Department of Agriculture and then with the Commonwealth. Murdoch University was named for Sir Walter Murdoch, who once reflected on his inability to pursue studies in medicine. There are probably people alive today who would not be alive if I had been their physician. I think the same can be said of me not entering clinical practice. There are probably animals alive today that would not be alive if I had been their veterinarian. As a government veterinarian, I work to prevent, eradicate and manage animal diseases in Australia and abroad. This involves monitoring and planning for exotic animal disease incursions and leading emergency animal disease outbreak responses and simulation exercises. Very satisfying work has been to help improve veterinary services in developing countries, which supports our development goals, and to chair the Management Committee of Wildlife Health Australia. Monitoring wildlife for exotic animal diseases is an important early warning tool. As Australia's delegate to the OIE, I have overseen the development of international trade rules, which aligns with my main work of developing scientifically based animal health and welfare policy and advice. As a government veterinarian, I have supported Australia's trade, importing industries and economy through export certification, import risk assessments, managing imported food, and by fulfilling international disease surveillance and reporting requirements. Government vets play an important role in Australia's trade and economy. As a country, we export more than half of all of our livestock products, and overseas market entry is largely reliant upon the control, inspection and approval of exports provided by government vets. Before moving to Canberra, I worked as a veterinary officer on export abattoirs in Western Australia, Victoria and Tasmania, overseeing food safety and animal welfare. Significantly higher returns to Australian farmers are achieved by accessing foreign markets. I have negotiated market access for Australian agricultural, pharmaceutical and service industries, and I was fortunate to represent Australia overseas as Agriculture Councillor in South Korea and again in China. Little did I imagine when I was a veterinary undergraduate that in the future I would be briefing the Prime Minister, premiers or ministers on horticulture and animal health protocols. Other government vets provide emergency disease response training or work in the livestock industries or protect public health against zoonotic diseases and the misuses of veterinary drugs. Some undertake applied research and development. As Australia's Nobel Prize winner Peter Doherty, also once a government veterinarian, said, "Don't underestimate the science in veterinary science." The last 20 years has seen a rationalisation of government services and a progressive reduction of investment. This has been brought about by financial constraints and a perception that veterinary services don't deliver benefits to the broader community and can therefore be provided commercially rather than being seen as a public good. Unfortunately, this retreat has not been met by an advance from the private sector, and as a consequence, our ability to detect and respond to emergency animal and emerging infectious diseases is progressively contracting. Fewer government veterinarians in the field mean that animal diseases need to be picked up by private vets or by the farmer. New technologies and innovative sensory systems and analytics help, but only go so far. We actually had an assessment of Australia's veterinary services conducted by the World Organisation for Animal Health, the OIE. The PVS takes the global veterinary standards and assesses how your country is performing against these. Australia has used the tool for a number of years when assessing countries seeking to export new commodities to us. In 2015, we underwent assessment ourselves and performed very well, as you might expect. We have a mature, coherent veterinary system in Australia. It's somewhat decentralised through our federal system. The next step is to use this tool at the state and territory level to assess biosecurity preparedness. In the event of an exotic disease incursion, we have well-developed plans in place. They are regularly exercised, but they are dependent upon effective surveillance to detect incursions and adequate resources to support a comprehensive response. Efficient veterinary services need to be able to consistently deliver early detection and notification of animal disease, which triggers a rapid and effective response. We need to be able to keep disease incursions out through effective biosecurity. We need productive public-private partnerships, and we need the underpinning of good quality education and research. It is important for the future of the veterinary profession and for veterinary schools that we open up demand for veterinary services. Many of the challenges I will describe in this presentation in our country, our region or globally can only be addressed through veterinarians and veterinary education. It is essential that we have the right number of vets with the right skills in the right places. Changes to the environment wrought directly by man or indirectly through climate change inevitably result in changes in disease dynamics. This interaction of the environment, animal health and public health is known as One Health. This collaboration across disciplines is only going to become more important as we face the world's emerging wicked problems, which I'll discuss further in a moment. And each one of us as veterinarians has a part to play in fostering that collaboration. Oh dear. Try again. There is a need to connect, or perhaps that is reconnect, the fields of human and animal health. The separate development of the human medicine and veterinary science disciplines throughout history and in almost every university fails to acknowledge the great similarity between the most humble mammal and ourselves. From our shared genomes to our common processes, and indeed our shared pathogens and ailments. The veterinary and medical professions have much in common. The same diseases and syndromes are treated, and we share pathogens as we live in the same environment. If we recognise that the vast majority of infectious diseases in humans come from animals, and non-infectious diseases have their animal host equivalents, we should be thinking about more closely integrating undergraduate education and postgraduate collaborative opportunities. There is a need to further strengthen collaboration between human, animal and environmental sectors and to extend this collaboration to developing nations, to develop expertise in interdisciplinary fields such as public health, epidemiology and integrated management of emerging infectious diseases, zoonoses and antimicrobial resistance, which I'll talk more of in a moment. The disciplines of veterinary science, medicine, environmental science and agriculture need to come together in order to equip experts to tackle global challenges. A well-educated veterinary workforce is key to providing scientifically based risk assessments, credible reporting of disease and effective delivery of veterinary services. The current quality of veterinary education is not acceptable in many countries, and this is a risk for everybody. One way to address this is through veterinary education twinning, whereby veterinary schools in advanced countries pair up with a veterinary school in a developing country with a view to improving their institutional capacity and expertise. One example of that is the twinning arrangement between the University of Queensland and Nong Lam University in Vietnam. This approach facilitates exchange of knowledge, staff, students, ideas and experience between veterinary education establishments, which can have an ongoing impact through the curriculum. Wildlife health sits at the intersection of One Health, but is sometimes something rarely thought about. Humans create ecologically simplified landscapes that favour certain wildlife species. These synanthropic species are generally of low conservation risk and are 15 times more likely to host zoonotic emerging and re-emerging infectious diseases. As these favoured species are present in increased numbers, there are more physical opportunities for human and livestock exposure. Additionally, pathogen amplification and host switching is facilitated. This suggests there is a link between land conversion, the global decline in biodiversity, and a rise in emerging infectious diseases of wildlife origin. And we know that many diseases that threaten human health and production animal health have and will arise in wildlife populations first. SARS, Ebola, Nipah, Hendra, rabies, influenzas, all have taken a heavy toll on human lives and on the lives of our production animals. Human encroachment on the natural environment has also meant massive habitat loss for wildlife, making wildlife epidemics more common as habitats shrink, populations become less stable and lose their resilience. Bats provide an example. Bats were once the most abundant mammalian species in northeastern America, but since the emergence of white nose syndrome, a fungal infection introduced from Europe, their numbers have declined by about 80%. This reduction must be taken seriously because bats are one of the main insect predators. Without them, more insects come in contact with humans, animals, and food crops and facilitate the spread of disease. In temperate regions, bats are primary consumers of insects, and a recent economic analysis valued the services of insect suppression provided by bats to the US agriculture at between $4 and $50 billion per year. It is unlikely that bat populations will recover quickly, if at all. Avian influenza is another example. Hundreds of millions of poultry have been destroyed in the past couple of years to try and stop the spread of avian influenza from wild migratory birds through poultry flocks in Europe and North America. In Australia, we sample several thousand wild birds each year for avian influenza, so our poultry industry can be forewarned of the avian influenza strains out there. Of course, influenza viruses are very unstable. They readily mutate. What is an avian influenza today may combine with an influenza in pigs and then move on to other mammals, such as dogs, horses, and humans. So wildlife health surveillance is important, but often neglected. In Australia, we have a national network which brings together wildlife carers, veterinary clinics, zoos, and governments to build up a national picture of what is out there. So the need for sectors to unite under a One Health approach has never been greater. The world is getting bigger. By 2050, there will be 70%, or 2.3 billion more people on Earth who will need 60 to 70% more food than what is currently available. At the same time, the world is becoming wealthier. More than 1 billion people in Asia alone are expected to move out of poverty as average incomes increase, as the Governor noted in her remarks. The diet transition that took developed countries a century only takes 20 years in emerging economies. Increasingly wealthy consumers in developing countries will drive demand for more and diverse foods. But we also want it to be safe, clean, and green. To meet this demand, more intensive and sustainable forms of agriculture will be required. Humans have such an unrivaled impact upon the environment, on the climate, on geology, and on our oceans, on every other living species, that this age has been termed the Anthropocene, or the sixth extinction. Humanity is driving species to extinction at a rate that is more than 100 times that observed in the fossil record. Vertebrate species have, on average, had their population sizes cut in half in the past 45 years. Meanwhile, the human population has doubled 4 times in the last 300 years. But the impact of humans is not limited to this extraordinary growth. The toll is exacerbated by the compounding environmental costs each additional person exerts. The scale of human alteration of the natural world is difficult to overstate. Since 2000, human beings have cut down more than 2.3 million square kilometres of primary forests. About 90% of monitored fisheries are harvested at or beyond maximum sustainable yield limits. In the quest for energy and control over water resources, humanity has dammed more than 60% of the world's rivers. And while we recognise that disease is caused by an interaction between the environment, a host and a pathogen, we tend to underestimate the influence of the environment in this equation. In 1998, more than 1 million pigs were destroyed in Malaysia, and industry was lost at a cost of $617 million US, and Australia gained access to the Singaporean market for fresh chilled pork. The reason was Nipah virus, but why did it emerge at that time? Farming practices in Malaysia had changed, so there were more pig farms in one area, and they were interplanted with fruit trees to use the manure. Thus, a population of fruit bats carrying the virus was brought into daily contact with pigs, dogs, and pig farmers. The virus caused a relatively mild disease in pigs, but nearly 300 human cases with over 100 deaths reported. The altered environment allowed the virus infection to be maintained and spread. Half of the global emerging infectious disease events of zoonotic origin in the last 60 years are estimated to result from changes in land use, in agricultural and food production practices. There are innumerable examples of this type of environmental change driving emergence of disease, of diseases spilling over from wildlife into humans or into our domesticated animals through our encroachment upon or changes to the natural environment. However, an improved understanding of the causal and ecological mechanisms of human diseases is needed. At present, not enough predictive power exists to accurately model human disease outcomes resulting from environmental change. The push for globalisation in trade and tourism will continue to bring new risks. In our eagerness to see ourselves as an exporting nation, we sometimes forget that Australia is also an importing nation, and with imports, whether they be people, animals, cargo or food, there are accompanying risks which may threaten our highly prized biosecurity status. Today, pathogens are transported around the world faster than the average incubation time of most epizootics. The international movement of commodities and people is unprecedented and, facilitated by climate change, is used by pathogens to colonise new hosts and new territories. There is nowhere in the world from which we are remote and no one from whom we are disconnected. As the Australian Chief Veterinary Officer, I am fortunate to represent Australia at the World Organisation for Animal Health, the OIE. The OIE sets standards for animal health and welfare used in international trade and for adoption by countries directly into their own legislation and standards. It is important that Australia be active in this forum, as standards that are too weak threaten our biosecurity, and standards that are too prescriptive impose additional cost on our producers and exporters. We seek to have influence at multiple levels by providing experts who develop and propose international standards, by commenting on those standards, and by influencing the strategic direction of the organisation. We also work with the OIE on the ground to enhance biosecurity and animal health surveillance in our own region. That surveillance has uncovered the emergence of foot and mouth disease virus strains in our region that have been introduced through the movement of livestock and animal products. These new strains are not always covered by the available vaccines. Obviously, these strains threaten the free countries in our region that act as a buffer for Australia. Further, the available vaccines are not always effective. Cheap vaccines are not necessarily effective vaccines. In addition, for some countries, FMD is not the priority that we think it should be. There are more pressing animal and human health issues, including basic food security. Surveillance is important in our own country. Surveillance underpins our ability to certify exports for livestock and livestock products. Countries are no longer willing to take our word for it that we are free from diseases of concern. We need to be actively looking for them. Surveillance will foreshorten the time taken to respond to an exotic disease incursion. Modelling done following the Matthews report has shown that the time from detection of a potential foot and mouth disease outbreak to reporting to veterinary authorities in Australia is so long, and the likelihood of detection in the field in the first instance is so low that it could be 6 weeks between detection and reporting to veterinary authorities. And in that time, as many as 50 farms might be infected with FMD. That's a frightening prospect, especially if you're the CVO or one of the many Australian farmers reliant on export markets for your income. We export 2/3 of our livestock products. In the event of an FMD incursion, all of our export markets for meat, milk products, milk, wool, genetics, and live animals would be lost and would take years to recover. These products would then flow back onto the domestic market, which would not be able to absorb them. We expect that our own consumers would reduce consumption during a large-scale animal disease outbreak, and regardless of whether we used vaccination or large-scale slaughter and destruction, Australian consumers would not be able to triple their consumption to maintain current production levels. Any such large-scale disease outbreak would require a proportionately larger response to deal with infected farms, to survey thousands of other farms related to the outbreak through proximity or ownership or transport or sales. The impact upon our rural communities would be devastating, and they would take decades to recover, if they recover at all, as we have seen from the experience in the UK. These are the sorts of scenarios that keep me up at night. My colleagues in the states and territories call me about once per week with some case of an emerging disease or an exotic disease to be ruled out, or some strange variant of a disease that seems peculiar to Australia. These calls usually come in late on a Friday afternoon, and so we feel that we are never entirely free, never far from having to launch a major response. The costs of emerging infectious diseases can be enormous. West Nile virus emerged in the US at the start of this century with 30,000 human cases and more than 1,000 fatalities. It cost $400 million US. Avian influenza has cost $1.25 trillion. SARS, which I experienced in China, cost $40 billion. These diseases emerge from animals, and so veterinarians need to be part of the solution. For the past 6 months, we've been responding to the incursion of white spot disease in prawns, our largest aquatic animal disease response, and certainly the largest response that I have dealt with in the 6 years I have been Australia's CVO. White spot has devastated prawn farming in every other country in the world that attempts it, forcing farms to move into other products or systems. The response has required the depopulation and shutdown for at least 12 months of 7 farms along the Logan River in southeast Queensland. More than 3 million litres of chlorine has been used to kill and disinfect 178 ponds. In our surveillance work in the region, we have found that white spot is now present in the Logan River and in Moreton Bay. We hope it will not become established there, but it will take a year or more to determine, and we have commenced national surveillance to determine the situation around Australia in our farmed and wild prawn populations. As you know, animals and humans share a common biology and common pathogens. And I would say that the most significant threat to this close relationship is the rise of antimicrobial resistance. Since the discovery of penicillin more than 80 years ago, each new variety of antibiotic brought onto the market has been quickly followed by rising resistance to that antibiotic in the bacteria we are trying to kill or control. This evolutionary struggle to survive on the part of the bacteria may well threaten our own survival, or at least our ability to carry out routine surgeries or to treat common infections. The World Health Organization has warned that we are facing a post-antibiotic era. Last year, AMR was discussed in a series of international forums culminating in the UN General Assembly, and it's not often that a health issue reaches the UN General Assembly. My father died in 2015. He had been suffering with multiple myeloma for 7 years, and his end came rather quickly, not directly due to the cancer, but due to a hospital-acquired MRSA infection. Anyone who goes into hospital is at risk of picking up such an infection, particularly if they have compromised immune system. Everyone needs to understand the problem and contribute to preserving these important life-saving drugs. But this is not a new phenomenon. Alexander Fleming was awarded the Nobel Prize for his discovery of penicillin, and in his acceptance speech 70 years ago, warned of the dangers of misusing antibiotics. AMR is a typical wicked problem, with no single action sufficient alone, and any action having unavoidable negative consequences for other stakeholders. Coordinated, collaborative, cross-sectoral action is essential. The drivers of AMR are multifaceted and interconnected. Human behaviour and actions across the health, agriculture and environmental sectors. The use and misuse of antimicrobials. Inadequate governance. Fragmented regulation around antimicrobial use. Lack of awareness of the risks of AMR. And lack of capacity to act among the many stakeholders, all of which are amplified by population growth, mobility and demographics. AMR does not recognise geographic or species borders. The common biology of our patients, whether they be human or some other form of animal, means that veterinarians and medical practitioners need to be working closely together, and veterinarians need to demonstrate that they are not the problem, but a critical part of the solution. There has been criticism of farmers, veterinarians and our farming systems as the majority of antibiotics manufactured are used in the agriculture sector. However, Australia's vets have long been proactive in fighting AMR, and Australia's agricultural sector is one of the lowest users of antimicrobials in the world. Australia's feedlot industry were the first anywhere in the world to implement a stewardship program, a program that seeks not to eliminate use of antimicrobials, but to use them appropriately, to maximise animal health and welfare and minimise the risks to public health. We need to find and establish a prudent balance. There are no immediate financial returns, but there are increasing market signals that retailers, processors and consumers want animal products raised without routine use of antimicrobials of medical importance. Reducing or stopping use of antibiotics alone will not be enough. It will not work. Better on-farm hygiene and biosecurity are needed to support improved animal health and thus reduce the need for antimicrobial use. Depending upon the antibiotic class, some 30 to 90% of the therapeutic dose is excreted essentially unchanged, to then be released into the general environment via waste streams. These streams inevitably expose wildlife to AMR, so now we have wildlife acting as indicator species of environmental contamination with AMR. Australia has adopted one of the most conservative approaches to the use of antibiotics in agriculture. We do not approve certain classes of antibiotics, and when approving antibiotics, the potential for AMR development is a valid consideration. Australia has been very conservative in registering antibiotics for use in food animals, particularly those of importance to human health. Globally, antibiotic use in the agriculture sector is increasing in response to demand for animal protein, either to support growth promotion or disease prevention and treatment. Globally, 2/3 of antibiotic tonnage is used in agriculture, which is why it is such a focus of concern for our health colleagues. But 2/3 of the global biomass is livestock. Animals should be healthy for their own welfare and for our food safety. Further, the attribution of the AMR seen in the human population to antibiotic use in agriculture is not straightforward. There is some evidence, but not as much as we might expect. And while Australia is one of the lowest users of antibiotics in agriculture, Australia is also one of the highest users in human medicine. Nonetheless, large quantities of antibiotics used to prevent disease or promote growth cause enormous selection pressure for resistant microbes. Globally, there is enormous momentum building to ban the use of antibiotics as growth promotants. A series of governments and commercial food supply chains are bringing this into effect. But the push won't stop there. Prophylactic use of antibiotics at the herd level will be the next to fall. However, I think there is an opportunity here for Australia. Through our excellent health status, our extensive farming systems and regulatory support, we already are one of the countries with the lowest levels of antibiotic use. Australia also has an excellent animal identification and traceability system. We have good partnerships between industry and government. Our systems are flexible and responsive. I believe Australia could put in place systems that anticipate and respond to these global trends. We could produce and certify livestock products produced without the use of antibiotics, or at least antibiotics of medical importance. To do this, we would need to be able to justify our claims, prove that this meat, milk or seafood was raised without the use of antibiotics, and to have the systems to underpin and prove this. We need to be able to collect and strategically use information on use of antibiotics in the veterinary sector in Australia. At the moment, we cannot do this. Currently, we collect data on tonnes of antibiotics imported and try and work out from there in which sector they have been used and why. We need an antimicrobial use monitoring system that gives us a greater level of granularity. I don't think it's good enough to be talking about tonnes at the border. I believe we need to be able to create a more accurate picture of how antibiotics are used at the farm and veterinary practice level. Our surveillance systems need to be able to track emerging antimicrobial resistance in animal populations and seamlessly integrate with the human surveillance systems so that meaningful comparisons can be drawn. I believe that we need this not only for our large animal and mixed practices, but also for equine and small animal practices. The pets in our home share our food, our living spaces, our beds, and our pathogens. Many of you, I am sure, will have seen resistant bacterial infections shared by owner and pet. This is a difficult issue in a regulatory sense. I'm from the Department of Agriculture. We don't have a clear mandate for companion animals. I've tried to pass responsibility for these furry family members to my colleagues at the Department of Health, but without success. But I anticipate that the pressure will continue. This slide shows antimicrobial use in Denmark. The first big drop was when vets lost the right to dispense. Then all antimicrobial growth promotants were banned. A number of European countries have split the prescribing and dispensing of antibiotics believing that a veterinarian profiting from selling antibiotics is unlikely to think twice about prescribing antibiotics. We need to collect evidence on prescribing behaviour in Australia. I know that some of our colleagues, when prescribing antibiotics for feed mix, not only prescribe the antibiotic to be used and the quantity, but they also dictate that the feed manufacturer has to purchase the antibiotics from the prescribing veterinarian. We still have veterinarians driving around the countryside providing a drug dispensing service. We still have farms with ready and routine access to antibiotics who have not had a veterinarian on the property for years. This is not how you run a clean, green food production system. In 2015, Australia launched a national antimicrobial resistance strategy. The Chief Medical Officer and I co-chaired the advisory group. A key next step for us is to accurately monitor and report both antimicrobial use and antimicrobial resistance across all species of concern. The goal of the strategy is to minimise the development and spread of antimicrobial resistance and to ensure the continued availability of effective antimicrobials. 7 equally ranked objectives are covered, which align with the strategic objectives shown in the WHO's Global Action Plan on AMR. All veterinarians need to be part of the solution. Educate clients regarding expectations on the need to use antibiotics. Review prescribing, dispensing and administering practices. For example, can narrow-spectrum antibiotics be used instead of broad-spectrum antibiotics for a particular case? Become familiar with the National Importance Ratings list to assist the preservation of antibiotics critical to human health. For example, minimising the use of third-generation cephalosporins, which are one of the few available therapies for serious salmonella and E. coli infections, particularly in children. Use published therapeutic guidelines where these are available. Use culture and sensitivity testing to target treatment for a disease or a condition, which will then allow adjustment of empirically used antibiotics. Apply infection prevention and control standards on farm and in the clinic. Use farm biosecurity plans to help reduce the occurrence of disease and prevent the spread of infection between animals and thus the need for antibiotic treatment. A key pillar of the Australian National Strategy is antimicrobial stewardship. This was taken up by the OIE at their general session 2 weeks ago, where key recommendations were made around reducing the need for use of antibiotics through better biosecurity and hygiene and encouraging the development of vaccines. Promoting prudent use of antimicrobials, which includes prescription and delivery by well-trained veterinarians or suitably trained authorised persons. Improving veterinary education on AMR in the core curriculum and in continuing professional development for both veterinarians and paraprofessionals. My department has sought to raise awareness and understanding of AMR by holding roundtable events on AMR with agricultural stakeholders and by having a dedicated AMR webpage. Australia also actively participates in the annual Antibiotics Awareness Week, which links to the global WHO and OIE events. Again, I'd like to encourage everyone here today, regardless of your field, to think about how you can contribute to the fight against AMR, how you might take on a stewardship role. We already have some good examples from industry and from the veterinary profession. Pilot studies have been conducted or are underway with the pig, chicken meat and salmon industries, with an AMR surveillance pilot due to commence soon in the chicken egg industry. Meat and Livestock Australia have funded AMR surveillance studies in cattle and in prime lambs. An antimicrobial stewardship group has been established with the pig, chicken meat and lot feed industries. And there's research underway into AMR isolates from clinical coliform mastitis in dairy cattle and from backyard chickens. I'd also like to acknowledge the AVA's leadership role in promoting stewardship of antimicrobial use in animals in Australia, an example being the trial stewardship program conducted last year with companion animal practices in Canberra. The Australian Veterinary Association has Fighting AMR as one of their five key strategic objectives, which promotes a number of initiatives on antimicrobial stewardship to the veterinary profession. The AVA also has fact sheets and guidelines on veterinary use of antibiotics critical to human health and guidelines for prescribing, authorising and dispensing veterinary medicines. To support judicious and prudent antibiotic use, the AVA industry and Australian government will be collaboratively developing best practice antibiotic prescribing guidelines for livestock, including pigs and horses. Evidence-based guidelines for dogs and cats already exist. The veterinary pharmaceutical industry has also contributed guidelines for the preparation and use of compounded pharmaceuticals. Our livestock producers also participate in various industry and supermarket-related quality assurance programs which assist them in reducing the burden of disease in their animals and the requirement for antimicrobial treatment. Animal Health Australia, an independent animal health body, produces information on farm biosecurity for livestock producers. Farm biosecurity promotes on-farm biosecurity and prevention of animal diseases, so farmers can identify the risks and incorporate measures to minimise them. The world is facing an array of wicked problems: emerging infectious diseases, antimicrobial resistance, poverty alleviation, food insecurity. I believe that veterinarians not only can but must make a significant contribution to finding solutions to these issues, working alongside our colleagues from other disciplines. Never before has the potential contribution of a veterinarian to the world's problems been so diverse, complex, and potentially rewarding. There are opportunities now and into the future for veterinarians to do significant and interesting work that sits outside the stereotype of the veterinarian in private practice. We face a challenging future, and I believe that all veterinarians are critical to addressing these challenges. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Mark, for a most insightful, impressive and global presentation, and emphasising the importance of our profession in fighting, emerging disease, antimicrobial resistance. So we have time for some questions. I ask you to raise your hand and please make sure you have a microphone before you speak. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, Mark, wonderful talk. Thanks very much. Just regarding the cooperation with practices, I'm a practice owner from the northwest of Western Australia, covering a third of the state just about, and been there for 40 years. I've got about a dozen vets work for me. Not once have I been, as leader of that group, been invited to cooperate with any governments in surveillance or disease notification. And yeah, I felt that's a bit of an oversight. So could you comment on that oversight, and if there's plans to really involve practices, and in any case take that open invitation back to Canberra? Thanks.
Oh, thank you. As I said, there is a difficulty in finding that linkage between government and private practice, particularly small animal practice, but even in the large animal sector. You will have seen an announcement perhaps from the Minister that there was $14 million given for AMR surveillance in the last budget. All of that went to the Health Department. In the previous budget there was $9 million that was given. All of that went to the Health Department. We got $200,000 and then we lost some of that as an efficiency dividend. So with that small amount of money, we were able to establish those pilot programs with the pig, the chicken, and the salmon industries. We need to find a sustainable model to bring private practices into the surveillance arrangements, and I very much welcome your suggestion of bringing the larger practices and the more remote practices into that. As I said, we had a good example with the small animal practices in Canberra last year, but that was an AVA initiative. It wasn't a government initiative, and I think we need to find a mechanism to do that. But to do that, we need governments to recognise that if we're going to be criticised for using 2/3 of the antibiotics, then we've got to be receiving more than a fraction of 1% of the funding that's used to address this problem.
Yes, you mentioned use of compounded antimicrobials. I know that there's widespread use of rifampicin and enrofloxacin. Compounded, as you know, they're not regulated at all by the APVMA or the Department of Health. I just wondered if the government had considered any kind of limitation on the use of compounded antimicrobials.
There's no consideration on what I'm trying to highlight is that the present situation, I think, is unsustainable, and that the global trends can't be missed. Every time that I travel to Europe, I receive criticism that our vets are able to both prescribe and dispense, that we're not undertaking detailed surveillance on use, that we don't have a joined up surveillance program looking at resistance. And I think also the commercial signals are becoming louder. So we've heard from a number of fast food outlets and retail chains saying that they want their products to be raised without the routine use of antibiotics. So I think those signals are unmistakable, and I think there's an opportunity here for Australia to be on the front foot because we've got a nimble, joined up system between industry and government. We've got great traceability systems. Most of our animals are raised extensively and therefore aren't using antibiotics routinely, unlike those in Europe where they're brought into barns through winter. So I think there's opportunities there, but I also see that there's a threat, and I wanted to bring that to the attention of the profession.
What can we do about the rogue vets who are basically irresponsibly administering antibiotics, particularly to farms, and what are the repercussions for them once you guys find out?
Well, this is a product of our federal system, so control of use is a state matter, and although as the Commonwealth Veterinary Officer I've obviously got a view and think that the states should step up, it's really an issue for the states. We have, through Animal Health Committee, which brings together all of the Chief Veterinary Officers at the state and territory level, started to address that, and we're also trying to address it through the Council of Australian Governments at the Agricultural Minister level. But to be frank, some states see it as a trading advantage that they have, and part of their lack of red tape that they allow this type of practice.
I just wondered about imported food. Is there a level of monitoring for antibiotic levels?
So there's no monitoring of any food in Australia for antimicrobial resistance, and because there's no monitoring of food domestically, we cannot impose requirements on imported food. So everybody in these types of discussions wants to talk about imported food, but we never test domestic food, and there are no national standards for antimicrobial resistance in food in Australia, and as a consequence we've got no standard to apply at the border. So there is no testing of imported food.
Mark?
Sorry, where are we?
Over here.
Oh, sorry. You should be down here, Mary.
No, I think you put the picture really well, Mark. I congratulate you for that. I really do, because I think this is a really key issue for the profession. But one of the things that comes across, and our medical colleagues have been saying that what we really need is a national independent authority to manage antimicrobial use and resistance, pulling across both the medical and veterinary side, and looking, I guess, at the veterinary side, not only at registration, but the control of use legislation, which at the moment is in the various state jurisdictions, and it's very variable across those jurisdictions. And there are some, as you've identified, some big black holes in the middle of this. So how would you see a national authority that would have the power to really implement a coordinated monitoring and surveillance program and hopefully improve antimicrobial use and reduce the resistance problem?
So you might be aware that there was a proposal for an Australian CDC, and I think that that's probably a model that is worth further consideration, so that we are dealing not only with the issue of AMR but emerging diseases and able to work across portfolios a lot more flexibly and nimbly than we currently are. At the moment it really relies on personal relationships and connections to bring about that type of dialogue, and I don't think it works functionally as well as it could. But certainly, if we can't get a CDC, then certainly a national body on AMR would be a huge step forward, and I think would show significant leadership in this area, which is a global challenge.
Oh, hi, thank you. Just as a private practitioner, if we want to do a culture and sensitivity, that cost has to be passed on to our clients. Because this is such an important issue, is there any way that could be, I mean, that's quite a considerable cost, and sometimes we can't do what we want to do because of that. It just would be worth considering if that could be something that could be subsidised. Indeed, and I know some of the universities are offering a subsidised culture and sensitivity as part of their research interest in the issue of AMR. But I agree, if we're serious about this issue, then we've got to make it cost effective to carry out the surveillance that I'm calling for.
Mark, Alan Guilfoyle, I'm President of the Australian Cattle Vets. At present, we're engaged in Queensland with the deregulation of pregnancy testing, and this is not only a state issue, it's a major Commonwealth issue because it impacts further on the protection and the quality of our export standards and everything else. But it goes much further, as you said, and my classmate down the front has just also commented on the reduction of disease surveillance, the presence of veterinary skills out on properties, particularly North Queensland, where we get these never recognised incursions from foreign fishing vessels that happen to run ashore and then get away quick. What can be done at Commonwealth level? I graduated in the days of BTEC, where Commonwealth initiative to rid Australia of tuberculosis and brucellosis, and that allowed vets like myself and right throughout the country to get out onto stations, establish a presence, a veterinary presence. We're able to recognise these diseases. If a lot of our services are deregulated, we can have lay blokes out there, they'll do the job. But if they saw 50 cows out of 1,000 slobbering at the mouth and hobbling around, and they're only 50 k's from the north coast of Australia, they said, oh, gee, that's interesting, and go away. And watch, you've got the country being loaded up with foot and mouth or something else. So it's back to your court, Chief Veterinary Officer, and we're doing our bit and fighting like hell, mate. So, but this could be a national tragedy for Australia.
Yeah, I think those cadetship programs laid a great foundation for the animal health situation that we've got in Australia, and that's a great inheritance. together with being an island, makes it a lot easier, obviously, and great quarantine and biosecurity arrangements. I think that there are ways that we can address that issue. One way that I've seen overseas is governments placing vets in remote locations and paying half their wage. So for half their time they're working for the government, and for the other half they're running a private practice and have to establish their own client base. But essentially that's a subsidy type arrangement. And I think if we're going to be serious about undertaking that surveillance of capturing an outbreak very early in the event, then we need to raise awareness of farmers, of people that are on properties like stock and station agents, but also of private vets, and we need to get more private vets on to farms, and that's obviously a key policy plank of the AVA, which we strongly support.
Tim Mather from the ACT. As part of the strategy, has there been any consideration to improving the immune systems of the humans and animals that are suffering these antimicrobial problems?
So under the national strategy, there are a series of sponsored research programs, and some of those programs are looking at probiotics, alternatives to antibiotics, and also immune stimulation. So that there is an element to that, but it's that's a long-term plan. But there are elements of that in the research program that's underway. Yes.
Mark, Alan Petrie. Firstly, thank you for the presentation, the excellent presentation, and perhaps a little later on I'd like to talk to you about the possibility of loading it onto the website of the recent re-established Veterinary Public Health chapter of the Australian and New Zealand College. But the first person who asked a question in relation to never having been contacted by people in the government, I'd respectfully suggest to our president up there next to you that this might be a role for the AVA to step in. I mean, we all know in regards to government funding where it comes down to the upright animal versus the others, that the upright animal group are going to get the money. So we as veterinarians have to do what we've always done, do what we can with what we've got, and it certainly strikes me that the AVA has a role to play as far as connecting the practitioner up with the likes of yourself. And so I think that's something that can be done now until such time as money might come forward, when people recognise there's still some, recognise that there's a great deal of public good in veterinary activity, something that has disappeared over the last 40 years.
One of the technical items at OIE 2 weeks ago, and I was lucky enough to be there and watch Dr. Mark Schipp in action, and I must say he works very hard on our behalf for the nation and for the veterinary profession over there, was the emphasis on public and private partnerships. And we particularly have an excellent relationship, our association with Animal Health Australia and also the Department of Agriculture and Water Resources, and we're building on this. So I think this is something that can, I guess, aid in disease surveillance, control, and obviously the AVA have limited resources, but we have a wonderful voluntary base, and we have an increasing profile, and so I might just sort of, I was going to ask Mark to comment on the public and private partnership concept.
Thank you. Yeah, as I said, I think the public-private partnership in Australia is one of our great strengths, and I'm always struck when I'm travelling overseas and seeing foreign CVOs interacting with their industry, how it's quite a different relationship than the one that we have. simply because we trust each other, we know that we can talk openly to each other, and we're all on the same page. In relation to your comment and suggestion, I have to applaud the AVA in being very active in coming to Canberra, engaging regularly with me and with my staff, with the Secretary and with the Minister, and I think that the relationship is getting stronger and stronger, and I agree with you that the AVA is the obvious platform to bridge between government and practice.
Ken Jacobs. I thank you firstly for speaking on this. I think it's fantastic. It's very well put together and very interesting. I guess for many years I've had concern that a lot of the things that you've been saying have been largely lip service from government to both the profession and the industry, and I think it's time that we really developed strategies to bring it from, yes, we need more private practitioner partnerships, we need more government vets, we need better laboratories, and each of the tests, each of the various exercises show the same thing. We need better improved aspects. But we've got the Australian Veterinarian accredited veterinarians, we've got that system, we've got the Veterinary Reserve, all of which aren't used. I think it's time that we move forward from lip service to action. And I guess I'd like your advice as part to the AVA as to what we should be doing as representatives of the profession as to how we make that happen, because clearly it's not going to happen from the top down. It's got to happen from the bottom up if the top isn't working. Could you comment on that?
I'm very pleasantly surprised with the response that I've had this morning and the suggestions that are coming from the floor. What I'd like to suggest is that my office meet with a small group from the AVA to talk about how we can progress these suggestions, because I feel very reluctant to, as you say, it's not going to work from the top down, it's got to come from the bottom up, and I feel, as the CVO, a bit nervous about imposing on private practitioners or calling for more from the AVA, knowing that it's a member-supported organisation. But if there is that desire and opportunity, I'd be very keen to take that up, and if there's a small group that I can work with from within the AVA, as we heard from the first intervention, I'd be very pleased to do that.
Hi, Mark. I was interested in your comment around the increasing surveillance and increasing monitoring. Do you think with the evolution towards molecular diagnostic testing and moving away from bacterial culture, with the capacity then to do sensitivity testing, that we're going to be walking into the future when we need to know more information a little bit blindfolded?
I think new technology is sort of a double-edged sword. It gives us a rapid response, and I think one of the great impediments in practice is that you're faced with an animal and a client, and you don't know what antibiotic to prescribe. You don't even know sometimes whether it's a bacterial infection, so a rapid diagnostic test would obviously assist in that. But as rapid diagnostics become more readily available and cheaper, it also means that they're not solely in the hands of veterinarians. And this is something that I've very much struggled with in the space of emergency animal diseases, is that I'm getting people contact me, or sometimes not contact me, just go straight to Facebook and say, oh, I found this exotic disease, or I've sent my sample to the US and got this result. And that's always an unpleasant surprise. So you know, it's a double-edged sword, and I think we need to think carefully about how we try and manage that flow of information and that technology, because it has enormous potential, but but it can be a bit embarrassing sometimes, and sometimes those types of posts or communications can have enormous trade and reputational consequences.
G'day, Mark. I just wanted to ask about, you mentioned a disconnect in the supply and demand of vets at the moment where there's an oversupply. Obviously there's some areas where that's not the case. And that it was going to come back into balance in about 2025. I was wondering if you could mention the forces at play that will make that come back into balance.
I think I was just drawing from the AVA's own work, but my understanding was that was the extent of their projection. I don't think that they saw it recovering after 2025, but that was the extent of their projection. Obviously, the dynamics in the industry are changing with a much larger female graduate making up as they move through the population of veterinarians. And I think a number of veterinarians are changing their approach to practice, a lot more inclined to seek a reasonable work-life balance than at the time I graduated. You know, you're a hero if you died in practice, or that doesn't seem to be quite so highly regarded these days, which I think is a good thing.
Hi Mark, my name's Kelly Thomas. I'm a small animal practitioner in Sydney. I just had a question for you in regards to helping the veterinary industry hopefully attract more significance and more funding from the AMR funds that are allocated, that are all going to human health at the moment. Currently, we don't report any multi-drug resistant infections that we come across in practice anywhere. And I was wondering if you thought, if we had that body of data, if you think that would be helpful in showing the significance of our industry, and if we were to collect that data, would we be required to also type those bacteria so that we could show the relationship? You talked about One Health as well, with those organisms crossing between human and animal populations. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. That would be enormously useful. So that there is a national database of antimicrobial resistance in the human population. It's called AURA. They produce an annual report. The way that database has been set up is that so that animal populations and animal data can be connected into that. And the intent is that we were able to show any relationship in terms of pathogens and resistance between the two populations. So if we've got access to that data, that would be enormously useful, yes.
No more questions. We'll.
Got one more if you want. One more?
Got one more?
Actually, some of that the multiple drug resistant bacterial isolates they're getting from canine ears and things, they are reported because the laboratories are supplying information, and they are being used by the medical profession to promote veterinarians losing their right to prescribe and dispense antibiotics. I'm sure I saw a report from the University of Adelaide from one of the medical professors there advocating that, and it wouldn't be the only report in existence.
Yeah, so Darren Trott's done a lot of work at Adelaide looking at clinical isolates of bacterial infections and conducting a culture and sensitivity on those. But equally, there are a number of papers which demonstrate that our animals have picked up multi-resistant infections from their human owners. And I think that we need to be a bit on the front foot. We need to demonstrate that we've got prudent stewardship programs in place, that we know our business, that we're using antibiotics responsibly, and that we're not entirely responsible for the problem, which is the way that it's sometimes depicted. You've probably seen the open letter that went to the Director General of WHO last week calling for intensive agriculture to be disbanded because of the impact on AMR and climate change. So that there are multiple threats out there, and I think veterinarians as leaders within the agricultural industry and within the health sector for livestock and companion animals need to be articulate and coordinated and be able to speak with authority on these issues.
Do we have time for one more?
Hi, Mark. I would like to know, do you generally do something about the general population? So farmers or owners of pets, for example. Is there any prevention or sensitization to the problem that's...
We've got some materials that we use to raise awareness in the general population, whether that be human clients and customers or patients, but also work that we try and do with farmers and veterinarians. So there's a range of materials available on our website, including some video that I recorded with the Chief Medical Officer to present a joint message on the issue of AMR. So there is a range of materials available. There's also materials available through the AVA, through the various livestock pig bodies, and also through the pharmaceutical industries. So I think that there's a sufficient awareness material. The real challenge is to get it to hit the road and be translated into meaningful action. Oh dear.
Mark, thank you for a lovely presentation. I just wanted to ask you a little bit about opportunities. You know, we already have in Australia through and supported by all the vet schools a program called Vet Compass that enables us to collect data on from all the practices that sign up to it around prescribing and also antimicrobial resistance in companion animals at least. What do you see the future for data collection and data analytics approaches like this to giving you some of the answers to that thorny question of what happens to all those antibiotics that come into the country?
I think we're through the pilots that we've done in industry, we've got a snapshot, and we probably can't do that as a rolling surveillance. What we thought was that we would supplement that with some of these prescribing behaviour studies, and it'd be good to be able to do those in a range of settings, small animal, large animal feedlots, and the like, the pig industry, for example. So I think there's really two approaches to this. The European approach is to issue a directive from the centre and impose regulation on veterinarians and on farmers, and say that you must report everything, all of your activity, and you must provide it in this format, and it must be received annually. The other approach, I think, and one that would probably work well in Australia, is one where industry and government come together with the universities and other partners and try and create a picture, but without imposing it from the top, but drawing it from all of the participants. And it's a bit more messy, it's a bit more of a patchwork, but in our regulatory environment, where we're not able to introduce new regulation and there's no appetite for additional regulation or additional red tape, I think that's a more useful approach. And it also provides an opportunity for direct outreach and communication with those that you're collecting the information from to say, well, this is your performance and this is that of your peers. Here's some information on antimicrobial stewardship. So that it creates more opportunities also than a simple regulatory approach. Peter.
Mark, congratulations on making a subject that can be very dry quite interesting, so thank you for that. I think in many instances, as with so many of these presentations, we're actually speaking to the converted because we're here to hear you speak on the subject. And certainly an issue that I've come across has been in-house testing being done for antibiotic resistance with no standardisation. It tends to be a certain echelon of veterinary practices that indulge in this activity as a cost cutter. But it also means that the results of those tests in many cases are very questionable. I wonder if you have any means of attempting to either persuade veterinarians not to do that, or if they are, to look at standardising it, because I'm unaware of any material out there for that purpose.
One of the dangers of having the title of Chief Veterinary Officer is that people think that I've got some sort of power or authority. I can't even get the dog to come inside. I've just undertaken a review where we went out to 200 stakeholders by questionnaire, another 60 we had in a workshop, and then we've done 40 interviews. Asking people what do they see as the role of the Australian Chief Veterinary Officer, and apparently I'm responsible for animal welfare, for antimicrobial resistance, for keeping Australia safe, and that I'm fully across all of our import risk analyses and export requirements. Obviously I can't do any or even a small proportion of that. As I've said previously, I think that the regulatory approach, the top-down approach, is not one that is currently viable in Australia. I'd love it. I mean, I'm a regulator. I'd love to introduce more regulation. I think we need more regulation, so you all do as you're told, but that's not the situation. What we do for laboratories when we're importing food, when we're importing prawns, for example, when we're doing all of our export testing, we require all of our laboratories to be NATA accredited, and we try and use that as a de facto standard, and we say we're not going to accept the results unless you're a NATA accredited laboratory for this test. And as part of this AMR surveillance program, where I know the human health sector are struggling with this because there's 3 different platforms or standards for antimicrobial resistance and sensitivity testing, and it's obviously a lot more diverse in the animal sector. Something that Mary and others have worked on is looking at a more standardised approach and saying that unless you are using the standardised approach and are recognised to a recognised standard, it won't be accepted. And I think that is probably a way that we need to go to look at laboratory accreditation. But how, I don't think we can ever stop people conducting their own tests in their own small animal clinic laboratory.
Thank you, Mark, for a most informative presentation. And I think Mark's across the strategic priorities for the association better than I am. He's talking for better regulation, which is one of our strategic priorities, so that's great. Lots of messages there. I think one of the ones was before you, resist the urge to go to social media until you've contacted the relevant authorities if you have an emerging disease outbreak. So with that, I will ask you to join me once again in thanking Mark for a wonderful presentation. I think it's lunchtime now, or getting close. Thank you.